After 17 years of marriage, my husband said something about our son that I can never unhear. And the moment those words left his mouth, I knew that everything I had been holding together for so long was finally coming apart. If this story speaks to your heart, please like this video and subscribe to her words. What happened after that moment changed the direction of my entire life. My name is Carol Hayes. I am 50 years old and I live in a suburb just outside Cincinnati, Ohio. I have been a high school history teacher for 22 years. I have a house with a big backyard, a dog named Rosie, and a teenage son named Caleb, who is without question the greatest thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. For 17 years I was also a wife. I say was because I am not anymore. But to understand why I am not, I have to take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the end. The actual beginning. Because this story did not start with one terrible sentence. It started 17 years ago when I chose to stay after I should have left. And it ended the night my husband looked me in the eye and said something about our own son that no mother should ever have to hear from the man she married. Richard Hayes and I got married when I was 33 years old. We met through mutual friends at a dinner party on a warm Friday evening in May. He was funny and confident and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. I fell for that completely. We dated for 2 years and got married. In a church in Cincinnati with both our families around us. It was a beautiful day. Richard was charming and warm, and I genuinely believed we were going to build something real together. For the first few years we were happy. Not perfect, but genuinely happy. We bought the house. We got Rosie, and then when I was 37 years old, our son Caleb came into the world and everything I thought I knew about love completely changed. Caleb was the kind of child who made every room brighter just by being in it. Curious and kind and funny from the time he could talk. He used to sit at the kitchen table while I graded papers and ask me questions about history for hours. He was interested in everything. He cared about people. He was and still is one of the most genuinely good human beings I've ever known. I would do anything for that boy. Anything. That is important to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. When Caleb was about 7 years old, something changed in my marriage. Richard started working late more than usual. He became protective of his phone. He was distant in a way that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. I noticed. I always notice, but I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself Richard was just stressed about work. I told myself that marriages go through seasons and this was just a difficult one. Then one evening I found a series of messages on Richard's phone from a woman I had never heard of. Long messages. Personal messages. The kind that told me immediately. This was not a work colleague. I confronted him that night. Richard admitted to a year-long affair. He said it was over. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me and he did not want to lose our family. I want to be very clear about something. I am not asking anyone to judge the decision I made next. I know some people would have left immediately. I know some people would say I should have. But I had a 7-year-old son who adored his father and a 17-year marriage that I was not ready to walk away from without trying everything first. So I stayed. I told Richard we were going to therapy. Not optional, not something to consider. We were going. He agreed. I spent the next 2 years in the most difficult and transformative period of my life. Dr. Susan Blake was my therapist and she was extraordinary. She helped me understand what I needed from a marriage. She helped me find boundaries I had never had before. She helped me see myself more clearly than I ever had. I came out of that therapy a genuinely different person. Stronger. More certain. Less willing to accept things that did not feel right just to keep the peace. Richard and I rebuilt something. It was not the same marriage we had before. It was more honest in some ways. More careful. We knew where the edges were now. We functioned. We raised Caleb together. We had a life, but I want to be honest with you. Even after all that work, there was always a small quiet voice somewhere inside me that wondered if I had made the right choice. I pushed it down. I told myself what we had built was worth it. I told myself stability and commitment meant something. I kept pushing that voice down for 10 more years. About a year ago, Caleb came to Richard and me and told us he was gay. He was 16 years old. He sat at the kitchen table where he used to ask me questions about history, and he told us in a voice that was steady and clear and brave that he was gay. He said he was comfortable with who he was. He was not confused. He was not going through a phase. He was simply telling us the truth about himself because he trusted us enough to do that. I reached across that table and took his hand and told him I loved him completely and nothing would ever change that. Richard said he loved Caleb too. He said he needed some time to process it. I watched Caleb's face when Richard said that, just for a fraction of a second. And I saw something there that broke my heart a little, not devastation. Just a small, quiet disappointment. The kind a child feels when they realize a parent needs time to accept who they already are. Caleb nodded and said, "Okay, Dad. Take your time." That was Caleb. Always generous. Always giving people more grace than they probably deserved. Over the following months, Richard tried. I want to be fair and say that. He never said anything cruel to Caleb directly. He never made Caleb feel unwelcome in his own home. On the surface, things looked fine. But I noticed things. Small things. Richard would get quiet whenever Caleb mentioned a boy he liked at school. He would change the subject. He would find reasons to be somewhere else when conversations got too close to Caleb's life and who he was becoming. I noticed. I always notice. Then we joined a new gym about 6 months ago. At the front desk of that gym, there were 2 teenagers who worked the check-in counter. They were transgender teenagers. Polite and hardworking and genuinely kind every single time we came in. I never once saw either of them do anything inappropriate or unkind. They were just kids doing a job. Richard became obsessed with them. He started making comments on the drive home after the gym. Small at first, then louder. He said things about how they should not be allowed to work in a public place. He said things about influence, about harm, about how people like that should not be around children. I listened to those comments for weeks. I pushed back quietly. I told him they were just kids doing nothing wrong. He would get irritated and drop it until the next time. I kept telling myself it was just ignorance, that he did not really mean it the way it sounded, that people could have wrong opinions without being truly wrong inside. I kept making excuses. Until one evening on the drive home from the gym, Richard said something that changed everything. He was talking about those 2 teenagers again, getting more worked up than usual. And then in the middle of his anger, he said something about Caleb. He said it casually, like it was a logical thought, like it made complete sense. I sat in the passenger seat of that car and felt the words land somewhere deep inside me. And something that had been held together very carefully for a very long time came completely undone. What Richard said about our own son in that car is something I have played back in my mind every single day since. And what I did the morning after is something I should have done 10 years earlier. Richard said that Caleb needed to be careful about spending time around people like that. That people like that had agendas. That he worried those teenagers at the gym might influence Caleb in ways that would make his life even harder than it was already going to be. Even harder than it was already going to be. I sat completely still in that passenger seat. Outside the window, the streetlights were passing one by one. The radio was on low. Richard was still talking. His voice filling up the car the way it always did when he was convinced he was right about something. But I had stopped hearing the words. I was hearing something else entirely. I was hearing 17 years. I was hearing a 7-year-old boy who used to sit at my kitchen table and ask questions about everything. I was hearing a 16-year-old who sat in that same kitchen with a steady, clear voice and trusted us with the truest thing about himself. I was hearing the fraction of a second on Caleb's face when his father said he needed time. I was hearing every small quiet thing I had pushed down and excused and explained away for 10 years. Richard finally stopped talking. He glanced over at me and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I was not fine. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside Richard and stared at the ceiling for hours. Rosie was asleep at the foot of the bed. The house was completely quiet. And I lay there and finally let myself listen to that small voice I had been pushing down for 10 years. It was not small anymore. It said, "Carol, you already know." I thought about Dr. Susan Blake, about everything I had learned in those 2 years of therapy, about boundaries, about what I needed, about seeing things clearly. I had seen Richard clearly. In that car. More clearly than I had ever allowed myself to see him before. This was not ignorance. Ignorant people can learn. Ignorant people can be shown something and change their minds when they care enough about the people in front of them. Richard was not ignorant about Caleb. Richard had a son who trusted him with the most personal truth of his life. And Richard's response to that truth was to sit in a car and say that his own son's life was already going to be harder. Like Caleb was a problem to be managed. Like who Caleb was needed to be contained. I made a decision in the dark that night that I had been circling for 10 years without ever quite landing on it. I was done. The next morning I called Diana. Diana Foster had been my best friend for 24 years. She had watched me go through the affair and the therapy and the rebuilding. She had never once told me what to do. She had just always been there. I told her what Richard had said in the car. Diana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Carol, it is time." I told her I knew. I called Dr. Susan Blake that same morning and made an appointment, not for couples therapy, for myself. I needed to hear my own voice clearly before I did anything else. Dr. Blake listened to everything in that session. When I finished, she asked me one question. She said, "What are you most afraid of losing?" I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, "I am not afraid of losing anything anymore. I am afraid of what Caleb loses if I stay." Dr. Blake nodded slowly. That was the answer that mattered. I told Richard the first wanted a divorce on a Thursday evening after Caleb had gone to his room for the night. Richard was shocked in a way that told me he had not seen it coming at all. He said we could work through it. He said it was just a difference of opinion. He said 17 years meant something. I told him 17 years was exactly why I was done. I told him I had stayed through the affair because I believed in what we could become. I had done the therapy and the work and the rebuilding. I had given him every chance I had. But I was not going to stay in a marriage where my son had to wonder whether his own father truly accepted him. Caleb deserved better than that. And honestly, so did I. Richard tried to argue. I did not argue back. I had made my decision in the dark the night before, and I was not going back on it. I called an attorney the next morning. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the house. Caleb stayed with me. He and Richard see each other regularly, and I have never said a negative word about his father to him directly. That is not my job. My job is to make sure Caleb knows that in our home he is completely and unconditionally loved exactly as he is. Caleb is 17 now. He is doing well in school. He has good friends. He laughs easily and often. Last month, he came home from school talking about a boy in his class named Jordan, and his whole face was lit up in the way that only happens when you are 16 and someone makes your whole day just by existing. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to every single word. That is what I am here for. That kitchen table. Those conversations. That boy. Richard and I are civil with each other for Caleb's sake. I do not carry anger toward him. Anger takes up too much space, and I have better things to fill that space with now. What I carry instead is clarity. The clarity I should have trusted 10 years ago. The clarity that came from one sentence in a car on an ordinary evening that finally made everything impossible to ignore. Sometimes it takes a long time to hear what you have always known. I heard it. And I am so glad I finally listened. If this story gave you the courage to listen to that quiet voice inside yourself, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Her Words for more real stories about real women navigating the hardest moments of their lives. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. Have you ever heard something that made everything finally clear? I read every single one. This is Her Words, and your story always matters here. Sonnet 4.6 Clow.